let's see. The recording is in progress. Here we are. We're going to actually start the book today. We got through the foreword. We got through the introduction last week. We're going to start the first conversation tonight. And as he said, he organized this. So the conversations, of which there are 4, are first, and then the letters, of which there are, what, 14, 16? And then the spiritual maxims are last. So we're going to get into the conversation here today. Before we jump into that, is there anything left over from last week? Anything that you've been processing? Anything that you would like to throw onto the table before we jump in?
I have a question.
Go for it, Judy. There you are. Yes.
Hey.
Must be present to win.
Yeah, really. I was listening to, I think it was last week's, although it might have been 2 weeks ago, as a matter of fact, because I don't think I was attending last week, but that's what came up for last week. Anyway, there was a discussion about how do you know you trust God? And I think the bottom line that was arrived at through the group discussion was that if you can kind of go with the flow and be aware that, and to stop your obsessive thinking and worrying or anxiety, that you're more grounded and you do trust God when you can let all of that stuff just kind of flow out of you and realize that God is in control and you can relax into that place. Was that kind of summarize what was talked about?
That's pretty good. The idea was that trust and anxiety are inversely proportional. As one goes up, the other goes down. And so the more you trust something, the less you have to think about it, worry about it, plan for it, all those sorts of things. The less it'll keep you up at 2:30 in the morning, that sort of thing.
I guess my question is, the focus was on worry, anxiety, and obsession. What if a situation where there's stress related to a relationship with our son-in-law and his family, basically. I guess it's spilling over into his family. And you might not be aware that you're in worry or anxiety over it, but you are very aware of your anger. And you're in a place of non-acceptance of who the other person is and what you can realistically expect of them or not. And if you stay stuck in that, I guess this is my question. Is that a failure to trust God? Different emotions than worry and anxiety, but it might be kind of at the ground level, buried underneath the surface. I don't know.
Yeah.
Just some thoughts.
Well, I think certainly if trusting God doesn't mean that we're always going to trust everything in life all the time, and we're never going to experience any anxiety or stress, because that's not realistic and it's not true. And so, yes, we're going to be blown all over the place. What we're talking about, though, is that our overall characteristic is the trust will be telling us that everything eventually is going to be okay in ways that we can't know right now. And that should characterize us. It should characterize us in the sense that we can recover from the stress and anxiety and the emotional triggering quicker and come back to center again. All those things are true, but yes, we're still going to experience all sorts of things, and appropriately so. I mean, sometimes the appropriate reaction is stress, and anxiety about things that are stressful. But yes, we shouldn't, obviously, hopefully we wouldn't be getting stuck there. And there gets to a time where we can accept that this is the nature of that particular relationship and it has to be accepted, and that we can recover our sense of balance and be able to continue to enjoy our moments and deal appropriately with the situation. But I don't want to say, oh yeah, that's proof that you don't trust God. No, that wouldn't be true, and it certainly wouldn't be helpful. because now we just got pressure and guilt dropped on top of everything else we're experiencing. Don't want to do that.
No. Okay.
So,
right.
so can I add something?
Absolutely.
So for Judy, I don't trust God 100% nor 50%. So this is my personality. I do worry and I do stress, and I'm a person who wants to preempt things.
Mhm.
If I can do what I can do to avoid a crisis, I do not want to put out fires, but I would rather act on something first. Then when I exhaust, if I can tell myself I have done everything I can, that's when I say, okay, God, this is yours. That's when I surrender. But
Mhm.
not until I cannot be at peace until I said, did I do everything I can?
Yes,
Then I let it go.
I hear you.
Yeah, but in the meantime, there's that angst and that
Yeah.
planning.
There-
If it
I think
doesn't
it-
work out, it doesn't work out. I get it. I accept that. That's when I surrender.
Mhm. Yeah.
But I need that
I hear you.
reassurance. Did you do everything you can?
Yeah,
One
and
thing-
sorry, who was saying? I guess I was just thinking that I know you weren't saying, you should stuff the other feelings and, kind of avoid doing anything about it. But there's wisdom in curtailing what you do say to people and how kindly and respectfully you treat them while you're in their presence. And I guess the frustration for me is facing a situation where the person is not willing or able or ready yet to consider taking further steps to try to resolve their feelings about the situation. And it's causing tension all over. It just is bleeding over me and other people involved, and I'm doing my best to practice my program and detach and realize that is for that person to work out, and I can try to be compassionate and offer that as much as I can. But it's been stressful. It hasn't kept me up at night, thank goodness. But it's live. It's kind of like an undercurrent that's running through some of our lives right now,
Mhm.
our family lives.
Yeah. Beth and Brady, were you going to say something?
You were. Sorry, I got a mouthful. I was saying an exercise, sometimes that can help a little bit. Let's just take a few moments and take an inventory of what God is doing.
Mhm. Yes,
That's great. That's great.
that is
Yeah.
very
Yeah. Look at Allison. Big thumbs up for you, Brady.
Yep.
She likes
Yep.
that.
I'm eating, so I know it's recording, so I'm trying not to like chomp, but I was like, that's good. That's real good, man.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
To be aware of that and be grateful for what is happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Brady is one of those annoying glass half full kind of guys,
Yeah.
Take that into account there. But you know what Ellen says is right. What Brady has said is so important, that you do everything that you can do.
Yeah.
There's this idea of a limit situation. We get into these situations that absolutely take us right to the limit of what we can control,
Mhm.
limit of what we can understand. You cannot press any further in. And life is full of limit situations, one after another, and they just keep on coming. And they are the reminders that we are finite. They are the reminders that we don't have control over all the situations in our lives. And they bring us to the precipice of having to make a choice. What are we going to do? Are we going to double down and keep trying to pound things into submission around us? Or are we going to accept the limitations that we do have in particular areas and be able to find ways to continue to live with things that remain unresolved? You know, we're always
Yeah.
talking about balancing the now and the not yet. Well, the not
Right.
yet are those unresolved things in this particular relationship that you're talking about, Judy. There's certain things that are not resolved, but can you still balance the now and be able to enjoy your moments in other contexts, even though this is still hanging out there? You
Yeah.
know, that ability to do that, to live with the unresolved nature of life, within the paradox of life, the uncertainty and the doubt, and all those things that we've been talking about, is key to being able to live in what Jesus calls kingdom, to be here now and understand what God is doing and not focus on what is not done, to be able to let the moment be enough for us, even if we're still working toward other outcomes and circumstances. I mean, this is the stuff of life. And it's going to be really, you're going to love this, because this first conversation is a little bit of a puff piece. It's only a couple pages long, and it just kind of lightly sort of introduces. But the second conversation really gets into some nitty gritty. And there's going to be some statements that Brother Lawrence says that are going to be real counterintuitive and are going to spin your head around. And we're going to have to spend some time with them, because what in the world is he saying? But it's speaking really to this very thing that you're bringing up, Judy, is that how do we deal with those kinds of I guess I can say it's a paradox, but it's almost a direct contradiction in life. And he was very conflicted, and he was for 4 years living in a kind of self-imposed hell of his own doubts and insecurities. And he's going to talk about that as well. So I think as we move into this, we're going to get some lessons from and some illustrations from Brother Lawrence that hopefully can help us in these very areas.
Thank you.
It's not going to be all sweetness and light from Brother Lawrence, is what I'm saying. That he just kind of, kind of went along a few inches off the ground in this lovely presence of God. I mean, it was a grind, but he got there.
Yep.
Jerry, you look like you really want to say something.
I'm just so glad Judy brought it up, because I'm struggling too with, as many of you know, my daughter and I, it went well for a week, but it's not going so well now. And I don't know how to, I'm hoping this book, I was really looking forward to tonight, because I'm hoping, I mean, I get depressed. I get, down that I can't seem to find a way to communicate with my daughter or please her, and I'm always trying to, please her, and it's never good enough. And, it just feeds into my not good enough. And as a person that considers herself and has been a mother since she was 7, raising 2 sisters and a brother, it's always been so important to me. So it affects me emotionally, spiritually. I've been depressed for 3 days because of this huge. And I took Nina's advice, and I didn't argue. She said, Jerry, just don't argue. And I did that. I kept my mouth shut. But then I go home and I'm like, now what? And I prayed and, got books out and, but I don't know how to get out of it. I don't know how to trust God enough. I like what Helen said, 50% sometimes, 100% sometimes, that I don't know how to get out of it. I don't. And I keep trying, and it's hurtful when your own daughter, constantly finds fault with you and constantly takes your inventory, and no matter what I do, it's not enough, and I let it affect me. I do, and so I'm hoping this is going to help me deal with it. So I'm so glad you brought it up, Judy. As you know what I'm going through. So yeah, I'm looking forward to learning how to do this presence and not let it take over what other people say and do and think affect what I do, say, and think.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, you can always buy a plane ticket. I mean, there's that
Oh,
option.
that's true. I can always
Yeah.
come home. And I've thought about it. Trust me.
I bet you have.
Mhm.
I'm
I
glad, I'm
have.
glad you're hanging in there, but recognize this is a limit situation, right?
Right.
You're up against what you can control and what you can change and what you can do. And so how do you deal with that? What are your choices? What can you do? Once you've done everything that you can, like Ellen was saying, can you accept and leave this unresolved? It's not yet the way you want it to be, but
Mhm.
can you still be now? And
Right.
enjoy everything about your grandchildren and everything around the edges of it. That's going to be the key, is trying to strike that balance. And it's really hard to do,
It is.
especially when you're right there on the point of it.
Mhm.
But it is possible. And Brother Lawrence shows us that it's possible. He did say, as we read before, that not everybody can attain the level of immersion that he experienced, but everybody can do better, and everybody can glean something from just the process of trying. And so if we're doing that, we're going to get better at it. And life will be experienced more serenely as we go. All right?
All right.
Okay. Well, let's jump in.
Right. Can I put one request?
Of
Because sometimes
course.
I come in late after work, etc. But I would like to request if you can say in the beginning of things, like first conversation, going forward, second conversation we're doing, or first letter, second letter, because I did not buy the book. I'm too cheap to buy the book. I have 3 versions. I have one book from another place that I got many years ago. And then I have a PDF, and then I have another version of the book. Of course, my pages will not correlate to yours.
Right.
But if you could just say,
Not
first,
only is it not going to correlate, but it's going to be a different translation.
oh, isn't it? Because the two
This is all in
versions are
French.
similar.
This is all in French, and so it's been translated into
Ah,
English. So
okay.
nothing's going to add up. So
That's
it's
right. I have all
fine.
3 in
It's
front of me.
$9, Ellen.
I'm sorry. I have all 3 in front of me.
Oh,
That's my OCD too. No?
all right. First
Okay.
conversation. And we are on page 23, except for Ellen, who won't be on page 23. There's actually no page number there, but that's where it is. Okay, first conversation, August 3rd, 1666. Today I saw Brother Lawrence for the first time. He told me that God had granted him an exceptional grace in his conversation, which took place while he was still in the world, when he was 18. He told me that one day, while looking at a tree stripped of its leaves and reflecting that before long its leaves would appear anew, then its flowers and fruits would bloom, he received an insight into the providence and power of God, which is never erased from his soul. That this insight had completely detached him from the world and gave him a love for God so great that it had not increased at all in the 40-odd years that had passed since he had received this grace. That's a interesting statement there, right? So if you think about it, he's standing there in the dead of winter and he's looking at this tree and he's feeling dead and he's feeling completely stripped and forlorn and abandoned and bare. And then he looks at this tree that is looking exactly the way he feels, right? But he realizes that spring is just around the corner, and as soon as spring hits, this tree is going to spring back to life. And so that was the metaphor for himself and the condition of his soul and spirit that he was feeling at the same time. And so his life was just under the surface, ready to bloom as well, when just the right conditions would present. And it was up to him, of course, to start supplying the right conditions, because God had already done that. He says that he had been a footman to M. de Fubay, the royal treasurer, and was a clumsy lummox who broke everything. That he had desired to become a religious, thinking that by doing so, he would be censured for his clumsiness and faults, and so would sacrifice his life and all its pleasures to God. But that God had outwitted him, and in his religious life, he had found nothing but satisfaction. That this had often made him say to God, "You have outwitted me." Now, in another translation, maybe Ellen's translation, it was "you have deceived me," is the way that that French word was translated. But I know when we read this, it seems a little over the top. Maybe all our psychologists are thinking this is not a healthy attitude. Here's this medieval idea of suffering for God's sake coming back into the fore. This idea that we need to suffer in order to become closer to God. So he's hoping that he goes into this religious order and they're going to punish him for being so clumsy and being basically who he is and how he is, and that in this way he would be able to suffer and get closer to God. So, and in the process, he found nothing of the sort had happened. First of all, the order didn't censure him for being clumsy, but God didn't either. And he got more and more satisfaction from God's presence rather than a sense of sacrifice and deprivation. And so he was deceived in that, he felt, at first at least, and probably wasn't too comfortable with the fact that he wasn't getting the sense of suffering that he thought was necessary for him to become closer to God. Just an interesting and different take on things, right? He continues that we should establish ourselves in the presence of God by continually talking to him, that it was a shameful thing to allow thoughts of trivial things to break into this conversation, that we should feed our souls on lofty thoughts of God and so find great joy in being with him. Now, a couple of things that we talked about earlier on this is that continually talking to him was usually a first step in establishing a dialogue and establishing a mindfulness and awareness of God's presence, but that eventually the prayer should be saying you rather than you saying the prayer. That a stream, a verbal stream, whether it's mental or whether it's actually spoken out loud, would run its course and then it would dissolve into silence. But that the verbal stream was the practicing of that awareness that got it embedded in us enough that it would continue on without thought. It became a default place for us. It went into procedural memory, it went into muscle memory, and then we didn't have to constantly be uttering that stream, because eventually we want to step away from those thoughts entirely. We want to be aware without thinking, but that would be a first step. And of course, he calls it a shameful thing to allow thoughts on trivial things to break into this conversation. So there is more of that shame and guilt, that Catholic guilt. But what he's talking about, it's a shame if you can't be able to just be present. If you let all the details of life take that presence of God out of your awareness. And then when he talks about feeding our souls on lofty thoughts on God, Thomas Merton had a very interesting comment that's just kind of the opposite of that. He's saying that when you spend your time having these lofty thoughts of God, it's like the loftier the thought, the loftier the illusion, because our thoughts can't contain God. They're just mental constructs. And if we put all of our emphasis on those, then we're deceiving ourselves again. So I know what Brother Lawrence is talking about here. He's just talking about continuing to dwell on God's presence, to let it transcend whatever the circumstances are, especially if the circumstances are distasteful to you, if they're uncomfortable to you, to let your thoughts continue to move above them and stay connected with God. Kind of what Judy and Jerry are talking about. It's very difficult for them to be able to deal with the circumstances as they are, but we all run into those areas. For 10 years, Brother Lawrence struggled with being the cook in the kitchen. He didn't want to be in the kitchen. That was distasteful to him. But he overcame that with what he calls these lofty thoughts. But we're not talking about theological thoughts. That's what Merton is referring to. The loftier our theological thoughts, it's kind of a sense of I suppose, a prideful way of thinking that we can actually describe the Godhead with these lofty, highfalutin intellectual thoughts. That would not be Brother Lawrence. He was not educated. He was not educated in theology. He was a very simple man. But he is talking about at least letting your thoughts loft above the grind that you may be experiencing at any time. That makes-
Dave,
Yeah,
I'm guessing like this whole philosophy of suffering being a part of our Christian practice is rooted in scripture somewhere. Is that an erroneous statement? Is that like, where does that come from? I'm trying to think of Bible verses that might suggest that. Is that a thing, or that came out of Christian? I'm not quite sure what my question is. Where I'm going with this is I have a lot of clients who are, well, they're coming to me because they're suffering, and a lot of them, one of them in particular, who I mentioned in here, he's the guy with the wife with MS and the son with muscular dystrophy. And he's in a place where he's really angry at God, and, got up Sunday wanting to go to church. And just the thought of having to roll his son into church with a wheelchair just pissed him off. And he ended up spending the day getting drunk. And I'm wondering if there's any value, and I don't know exactly how to thread this, but any value in, putting a positive spin on his suffering and what that might potentially look like.
Yeah. Well, the suffering we're talking about here, this Catholic idea or medieval idea of suffering, bringing us closer to God, can be rooted in scriptures where Jesus is saying something like, pick up your cross daily, deny yourself and follow me. There's a passage from Paul where he says, by his stripes, by Jesus' stripes, we are healed. And that would be the stripes of the flogging. Okay, so there are passages like that that are suggested, but the thing is that those are really intended to be metaphorical.
Right.
It's a metaphor, and not literal. That's the point of it. When Jesus says, pick up your cross and follow me, it's the same thing as Paul saying that the old man must die. That old understanding of who I am, the old obsessive compulsive thought and behavior patterns must die so that I can become this new creature that actually has trust at least 51% of the time. And those kind of, obsessive compulsive patterns can start to fall away. That's the idea of that. By his stripes we are healed is Jesus going to the cross to show us perfect love and suffering what he suffered in order to be able to show us the lengths to which love will go. Now, that has been understood more in a mechanistic way, that this is the way that we appease an angry God. And then, of course, you add onto that the doctrine of original sin, that we're all totally depraved and stand outside of God's grace. And there's nothing we can do to change that. And so that idea of humans in a depraved state, in this lowly state that are looked at the way Jonathan Edwards in 19th century America said in Sinners of a Angry God, as if we were being dangled over the fire as a loathsome spider would, and you would want to drop him into the flames. That is the way that he understood God looking at us as depraved human beings. That kind of mentality is what fueled a lot of this sort of understanding. And so we're going to see that in Brother Lawrence. He's certainly a product of his time. But the interesting thing about Brother Lawrence is, even as he feels this way about himself, that he's this clumsy lummox, that he was worthless, at the same time, he never let that stop him from experiencing God's presence. And eventually that presence won him over. He never saw himself as necessarily worthy, but he realized it didn't matter. It didn't matter to God anymore. And so there's this real interesting kind of juxtaposition in Brother Lawrence, where he has that kind of typical medieval mentality and that sense of worthlessness, but at the same time, it doesn't matter to God, so it didn't matter to him. He went 4 years thinking that he was going to hell, that he was just damned, and there was nothing he could do about it. Whether he was a religious or not, it didn't matter. Until finally, this practice of presence won him over, so that he just stopped thinking about it. He just didn't worry about it anymore. It just didn't even come up. So there's that's kind of the grind here. As far as you talking about how can you put a spin on suffering, well, that always has to, I go back to Viktor Frankl for that. It's all about meaning.
Mhm.
As soon as there is meaning in the suffering, then it's still painful, but now it has some nobility. Now it can be overcome. Now it can be moved through. And so finding that meaning is going to be the key, I think. And that's what Brother Lawrence did. He found a meaning in the pain. The meaning he found was in the presence of God itself. And that gave him meaning.
It reminds me of this article I read some years ago, a few years ago. And I mentioned it in one of our discussions a few months ago, was this janitor cleaning these dirty bathrooms and toilet bowls. And there was a shift in his thinkings. I know it was yucky. There was a shift. He's saying, I'm making this clean for the teachers, for the staff, and for the students.
Mhm.
And that gave the purpose. It wasn't, he's still doing the dirty work, but it did not become, there was purpose and meaning.
Mhm.
And then there was another podcast I was listening to, and this was only a few months ago, where the man, he became a widow, and he was suffering, and he was in pain, and he goes to the psychologist. And he's saying, you know what, why did God do this? I'm suffering, he could have taken me first, then I wouldn't suffer so much. So this is what the psychologist said, although he lost the client, actually. What he said was, just think of it this way. Had you died first, then your wife would be suffering. Guess what? You alleviated her suffering. And so he got up, the client got up and never came back. And I think that's what it meant. That's what it means.
Mhm.
There was a purpose in me surviving my wife so
Mhm.
that she doesn't suffer.
I
And
think
that-
that was Viktor Frankl, actually.
Yes, that story
Well,
comes
maybe.
right out of Man's Search
Ah.
for Meaning. That's Victor.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay. That's so yeah.
But that's the idea. Where is the meaning in the suffering? Where is the meaning in the pain? And it's not that the suffering contains the meaning intrinsically necessarily, but it's up to us to find it for ourselves. What does it mean to us? How do we assign meaning? Because that's going to make all the difference. And if you can't do it, then it's just going to be suffering. If you can do it, it's painful, but now it's overcomable. And there's a nobility to it, even like in the story that Ellen just told us. The man who lost his wife, now he realizes that his suffering was furthering his love for his wife. And so his ability to grieve can move forward, and so on and so forth. So it's meaning is key.
Mhm.
Let's read a little more. That we should enliven our faith, that it was a pitiable thing that we had so little faith, and that instead of taking the faith as their rule of conduct, men amused themselves with petty devotions, which changed from one day to another, that the way of faith was the spirit of the church, and it could lead to a higher state of perfection. I know we're kind of just going paragraph by paragraph, but there's so many of these thoughts in each one of these paragraphs. So he's saying we should enliven our faith, that it's pitiable that we have so little faith, that instead of taking faith itself, as our rule of conduct, that people amuse themselves with petty devotions which change from one day to another. What do you think those petty devotions are that he's talking about?
Just the prayers, the prayers that don't translate into any change in behavior, essentially, or even experiencing God.
Okay.
Or the little rules you have to follow, it seems petty, like little things. Rule following.
I think that's another good one. Yeah. Rules, prayers, rituals.
So I
Anything
was,
you can think
I
of?
was, what I was going to say was like little ritual from the vestiges of my Catholic faith was lighting candles, in front of the altar, in front of a statue, and just, offering it up with someone in mind. It's very comforting, but I guess it's a way of surrendering for some folks.
Mhm.
I remember when we were kids, the girls, you have to have a veil on top of your head. So
Yeah.
sometimes we forget, so we have a handkerchief or something. That wasn't the point.
So think about the context here. Where is he going with this? He says we really need faith that is the basis of our conduct, the way we conduct ourselves throughout the day. It's the basis of just how we go about doing life. And instead, there are so many people who are amusing themselves with these little devotions, these petty devotions, which are constantly changing from day to day. This reminds me of again, Thomas Merton, where he said that people who come sometimes to the monastery or come to contemplative practice, and basically they just make contemplative faces at themselves in the mirror. Do you remember that line? It was so perfect that you're just projecting. You're just putting a mask on. You're making contemplative faces. You're going about what you think contemplation is about for some reason that you think will advance yourself somehow. Either advance yourself in the eyes of others, or advance yourself and you think somehow this is your spiritual progression to do these certain things in this particular way, and to amuse yourself by making faces in the mirror that look like they're pious, look like they're devotional, whatever they may happen to be. Basically practicing ritual over any kind of substance, any kind of substantive way that's going to fundamentally change our relationship with life and our relationship with each other. And he says they change from one day to another. It's not necessarily the ritual that changes so much, maybe, but it can be the way that we approach the ritual. For instance, when I was growing up as a Catholic, the rosary was a big part of what we did. We were saying the rosary at times, in school, and we'd go to church and we'd say the rosary, and the rosary was a big deal. Now that's a ritual. It can mean everything or it can mean absolutely nothing. And I can tell you as a child, it meant absolutely nothing to me. It was excruciating to have to sit there and count those beads and say all those prayers over and over and over again. If you really approach the rosary contemplatively, and those prayer beads are just the way that you don't have to think about what you're doing, you can completely let that mundane mental activity just become a hum in the background, and you can move into that contemplative space, and yet you're still, that's what prayer beads do. They keep you on track, moving through a system that you don't have to think about anymore. These little short prayers, you know them by heart. You just say them over and over and over again, and you can move into a contemplative state. I think the petty devotions to me are anything that keep us on an intellectual plane, keep us thinking with our heads egoically, whether we're looking at all of this as moving us forward to some outcome we're looking for, or are keeping us thinking rather than losing ourselves in presence. The petty devotions keep us at that surface level and don't allow us to move down deep where faith is really located. Faith is that place where we can continue to act in the presence of doubt, in the presence of unresolved relationships, in the presence of paradox, all those things that are there. And the petty devotions keep us at a level of maybe certainty, of thinking somehow, we're in control of this. But faith takes us out of control, and it's the opposite of that. So I think it's important for us to think about what it is that we do in our spiritual formation. And is it keeping us at that surface level, or is it really allowing us to sink deeper? And it's not that the ritual needs to change, but our approach to it may need to change. Just like the rosary. The rosary can be great, or it can be just nothing at all. It depends on how we approach it. Like any sacrament, it's an outward expression of an inward transformation. Well, is that inward transformation really occurring? Are we allowing it to occur? I was also thinking it can be us continuing to look for intellectual knowledge and answers, looking for certainty. You know, some people are so fixated on finding the next book, the next blog, the next author, the next guru that is going to answer the questions that you need answered, that they never are just allowing themselves to consolidate what they do know and let it percolate, let it steep, and actually let it start to change the way that they conduct themselves from day to day. So to me, the petty devotions are the ones that keep us on the surface, or as Richard Rohr would say, keep us on the circumference. Remember, he talked about staying on the circumference or the surface of the sphere rather than going in. Maybe that's another way of looking at it. But I think he's making this a huge point here that we need to consider. Any more on any of that stuff? All right, let's pile on another paragraph. That we should surrender ourselves in things temporal and in things spiritual entirely and with complete abandonment to God, and take our happiness in doing as he wills, whether he leads us by suffering or by consolation. For they are all the same to the soul, truly resigned to his will. That we must hold fast to our faith in those periods of spiritual aridity by which God tries our love for him. It is then that we should make proper acts of resignation and abandonment, a single one of which advances us spiritually. So there's a bunch of stuff to hate in this paragraph, right? I know what Becky's thinking. I mean, this is, you know, this way of speaking and this way of thinking, but really, if we break it down, there's really good stuff here. Obviously, surrendering ourselves to things that are both temporal. That means they're physical, right? And also in things spiritual. So it's the day-to-day things that we experience in life, right? As well as the interior things that are spiritual. To surrender ourselves to all of that, the things that we're doing and the things that we are experiencing interiorly, entirely, and with complete abandonment to God. In other words, to acknowledge our creaturehood, to acknowledge our dependence, to acknowledge our vulnerability, and to take happiness in doing what he wills, whether he leads us by suffering or consolation. Now, does he actually lead us? You know, kind of like the Lord's Prayer, lead us not into temptation. Well, that's not really the way that the original translates. That was a King James version of it. You know, do not let us succumb to the temptation would be a better way to translate the Lord's Prayer. And once again, is God leading us by suffering? Does God give us the suffering in order to teach us something? We talked about that in terms of 1 Corinthians 10:13. Remember, he doesn't give us more than we can bear, that we hate that slogan, but it's not an accurate translation of 1 Corinthians 10:13, where Paul says that the suffering that we do experience is just what's common to mankind. It's just what comes with the skin suit. It comes with the way the world is, that is always going to be serving up problems and challenges and traumas and illnesses and all the things that we just need to deal with. God's not giving us those. He's not using those as teaching tools. Once again, can we find meaning in them, though, even if it's not there intrinsically? What is it teaching us? What can it teach us? That's how we can be led by the suffering of life, as well as by the consolations, by the good things, the joyful things, right? But to see God as the giver of the suffering, the giver of everything, is a certain point of view. And a lot of us feel that God is orchestrating our lives. And so we have to answer these questions for ourselves. That if God is orchestrating our lives and putting everything together, then what happens when things go terribly wrong? You know, is God doing that to us as well? So those are questions we have to answer based on what we see as our paradigm. So he obviously sees it this way, and you can see it in a different way. But this idea of whether it's suffering or consolation, it's all the same to the soul truly resigned to his will. All the same. Is
Mm.
suffering and good things all the same? Really? That's a counterintuitive statement, right? But he is making a point that once we can see purpose in all of the occurrences in our lives, the good things and the not so good things, then it does become the same. The circumstances mean less and less as we are seeing more of the purpose and the meaning in the circumstances. They affect us less. And we can continue to push through, to rise above them, and continue to grow by them at the same time. How is that settling with any of you?
Sounds good.
I'm having a little trouble with the phrase by which God tries our love for him.
Yes. Mhm.
Really? I don't buy that at all.
Well, that's basically just a restatement of what he said above, right?
Yep.
We find our happiness in his will, whether he's leading us by suffering or consolation. I mean, it's the same thing. God is trying our love for him. Same idea that God is testing us, that idea of being tested by God. You know, does God really do that? Does God test us? Does God try
Is
to
he-
break us so we can prove ourselves? Is that really God's MO?
Is he saying that that is God's intent? Is he saying that God does indeed test us? Is he saying that?
That's just his assumptive way of speaking, right? That's sort of the assumption back there, the theological assumption that God is the orchestrator of everything that happens. It's kind of akin to the Jewish idea, right? The Jews
Exactly.
believed that God did everything, that nothing happened outside of God's will because God was sovereign and God was unopposable. And so if something happened, God willed it just because it happened and not something else. And this is really the same idea that's going on here. God is sovereign. God is unopposable. So everything that happens because God is using it and doing it in some purposeful way. But is that really what's going on? I believe that these are cultural manifestations and articulations of a cultural viewpoint and not necessarily descriptive of God's nature, even if it's in the Bible. But that's me. And I have a certain view of the inspiration of scripture as being that the authors are inspired who wrote the words, but not the words themselves. They wrote still understanding their own culture the way that they did and the language the way that they did. And they were free to do that. And so we have to then start to look at the prescriptive and descriptive parts of scripture again, like we were talking about last Sunday, you know, that not all of it is prescribing God's nature and the way that we're supposed to relate to him, but describing the way that these authors saw it. And so I would look at it that way in these terms. This is the implicit and assumptive way that that Christians at this time and at this place understood their relationship with God. But the beautiful thing for Brother Lawrence is that he was able to transcend that. Even believing that this was the way of it, it didn't deter him from being able to completely abandon himself to God. And so for him, it was not a detriment. Whereas for some of us, yeah, it would be pretty off-putting, wouldn't it?
Do you think the reason it wasn't a detriment to him was because he was living within or acting or believing within the confines of his culture, which is why for us it feels dissonant. It's just not, it doesn't ring true.
That could be true. Absolutely. You know, he was completely inside his culture. And so these things weren't even questioned. I mean, it was just the ground you walked on. It was the air that you breathed. It was the worldview. Just like we have our worldview that we don't question, right? It's just the ground we walk on and the air we breathe. And part of the process of taking our spiritual journey is to question that worldview. Is it really taking us where we want to go, or is it limiting us from being able to see the truth that's right in front of us? And so now you're into Jesus saying, sell everything you've got, give it away, and come follow me. Are you willing to drop your nets at the shore and come follow me? Are you willing to die on the cross daily, deny yourself and follow me? I mean, this is the whole point of the spiritual process, is to question everything. Now, for Brother Lawrence, it wasn't so much an intellectual questioning, it was just a moving on through, kind of, the big lummox just kind of barreling on through and just doing what he did and finding this presence that was unbreakable to him. And it's sort of just, everything else just kind of got displaced in the process, is kind of the way I see it. Because he wasn't theologically or intellectually thinking his way through and reasoning his way through. Like you read Augustine or some of the great theologians, man, they're thinking their way through this. He's not doing that. He's just experiencing his way through. He's much more akin to the desert father, much more akin to the desert fathers and mothers than the theological greats. I'm sorry, go ahead, Brady.
I'm just going to be a little bit of a devil's advocate.
Go
First,
for it.
I agree with Becky. We're tested, but I don't think God intends us to be. But I definitely know that we are. But here's what I was thinking. If even your suffering is caused by God, and that's his intent, isn't it a little bit actually easier to have faith in God?
Easier to have faith in God
if God is the one who's if God is the author of your suffering.
Right.
And
I mean,
and define faith in that respect. What do you see? What is it easier to have?
To surrender yourself to God, to surrender your will to God, to surrender self, period,
Okay.
ego to God. Isn't it easier to do that if you believe that God is the author of everything, including your suffering? I think that if you don't see God as the author of your suffering, I think then faith is more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
I think it requires more in terms of an act of submission.
It's more confusing because you don't know who to blame, right? Not really, but
but I think that's very truthful about faith. I struggle with my faith, and I struggle with surrender, because I remember a counselor, this was 5 years ago, I was in the midst of my turmoil. The counselor said, it's the one from Fullerton Free, she said, "Ellen, you're being tested." And I remember angrily saying, "I don't want to be tested." That's my protest. Not only that, I said, "And what if I fail?" You see. Because I put myself in a position of a mother, and I have my young girls. Would I test their love for me? I will never do that. And I don't think God will do that to us. Oh, I'm testing whether you trust me or not. I'm testing your faith. I don't know how to put it other than that's a cruel thing to do to your children.
And
that's why
I would agree with that. So it's kind of in reaction to what Brady's saying, and depending on how you define faith, it may well be easier to have faith in God if he is the sovereign and the absolute and is testing us, and everything that happens because of him. But for me, it's harder to have trust in God, a God like that, in the sense of being able to let go of my anxiety and my stress, because I don't know where I stand with a God like that. It may be easier to surrender and submit, but trust, see, that's a whole different trip for me. And the whole point for us is to get to trust. Wherever you see belief or faith in the Bible, the words there mean belief, faith, and trust all together. And to me, it's a continuum from the idea to the action, and then to the experience of trustworthiness that allows us to relax and actually live as if things are going to be okay. So trust is harder for me, but apparently it wasn't for Brother Lawrence, and maybe it's not for Brady either. So.
But it could feel like you're not measuring up, like Ellen says, and then you're back to the performance. I'm not measuring up. I can't pass the test. I don't meet the standard, and then it becomes a feeling of you're just failing.
Right.
Mhm.
By the way, trust really is not that difficult for me. Because in times of difficulty, I trust God to find things in me or within the people around me to find ways through that difficulty. I think that God is a resource when difficulty comes, when suffering comes.
Mhm.
And I trust that. I don't see God as someone though who is inflicting me as a test. That like you, I couldn't trust that God.
Mhm.
That kind of capricious dude up there in heaven at a dashboard saying, "Oh, Brady's going to have cancer," you know, or Scotty's going to have this. It's like no. I
So
reject
maybe it has to be balanced with personal experiences that you've had that have lifted you up, that you have no idea how you got through a situation that you were struggling with, but realize that he was incredibly tender and supportive and got you in place with people or resources or things that happened that it was unmistakably him. I don't know. Maybe there needed to be a balance before you can really fully trust if there's a life-threatening situation that you're facing. Can you draw from that in order to see that situation as healing you in some way, you know, on some level? Well,
That's great. You know, and full disclosure from me is that when I was just starting this whole spiritual formation of mine, I was agonizing in mistrust. I mean, I was just trying to find a way to be pleasing to God because I just felt that I had fallen so short. And everything was about trying to find that formula, trying to find that way that I could be sure that I was in God's good graces. And that just drove me, and it was excruciating. And so I personally needed to find a way around that I could get to just relax, you know, in this whole thing. And what I'm telling you is kind of the result of where that led. But for some of you, and obviously for Brother Lawrence, he didn't need to go through the same kind of intellectual drama that I went through to get to trust. He went through some excruciating times that were experiential, and maybe it's the same thing. I don't know. It's hard to say. I know mine was very intellectually based, and I had to break that down to get to a place where I could trust. And so maybe it was the same experience, or maybe it was different from Lawrence's. I don't know. But I just know it was very important for me to be able to understand God in a way that I could finally trust and be consistent with the scriptures. You know, I didn't want to be pulling this out of the air, just what I wanted. I wanted it to be something that was defensible in terms of what I understood about the central position of the book in my faith and church and life. And to me, I was able to thread that needle in the Jewish Jesus and contemplative practice. But yeah, it was important to me. But I think everyone may experience it a little differently as well.
But it could be because it's based on our personalities, how our brains are wired. That's why we perceive things differently or react to things differently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And our experiences are different,
Mm-hmm.
and our core beliefs are different, and there's a lot of different things. But the shape of the journey does remain the same for all of us. That general shape, how we experience it and how we will express it, of course, are infinitely different. And Brother Lawrence is one of those expressions. But I think we can learn a lot from him, obviously, about how it will influence the way that we go about our journey as well. But these are real central questions, and they need to be considered. And so it's great that they're coming up even in these first conversations. because we need to go through them, and we need to let them hit us in the face, and we need to disagree with them and throw things at the wall and go through all that process, and then come out the other side with whatever we think is sensible and allows us to be able to continue to move forward, and realizing that we're going to keep revising them as we go. We're always only one trauma away of having to rethink the whole thing. And so we just keep that flexibility in mind as we go, and we can keep pushing forward.
Dave,
All right.
I'm sorry. I know you guys are going to move on, but I'm what you guys were talking about just now, basically, is that the deism and theism, basically, that you were talking? I think that's what it was, like last week or something. You were talking about the two different beliefs on how you view what God does in your life. But I have a question mainly for you, because, yeah. So, do you believe that coincidences happen, or that like there's a purpose behind everything that happens? Because this is the background to the question, I would think, because okay, thinking that God or the creator or what have you is not putting certain situations in your life or testing you, does that mean you also wouldn't believe that everything is happening for a reason and each moment are like connected? Does that make sense, the way I'm wording that?
Oh yeah, it makes total sense, and I understand exactly where you're going with that. You're really putting me on the spot, Allison, because I'm gonna say something that some people are going to violently disagree with, probably including my wife. But and I'm only speaking for myself now.
Right.
And remember, what I believe is that we all need a personal theology that allows us to be able to move through life doing the two things, right? Accepting life on life's terms and living with hope and gratitude. If we can do that, then I think our theology is working. That doesn't mean it's right, doesn't mean it's true, ultimately describing things that can't be described, but it's working for us because it allows us to live life in kingdom, as Jesus talked about. I believe I'm not a deist, I'm a theist, but maybe a modified one. I believe that God is present, absolutely present. He's immanent. He is imbuing everything on earth that we experience. And that gives me a sense of closeness with him, the same kind of sense of presence that I think Brother Lawrence has, not to his degree. But at the same time, I don't believe that he's orchestrating every event. I think he created the world in such a way that it creates the mix that every one of us needs between pleasure and pain and advancement and confrontation. And so he's not doing those things to us, because to me, I can't trust a God who would test me in that way, kind of the way Ellen was talking about. And so I do leave room in my theology for coincidence, in the sense that the events themselves do not necessarily carry the meaning or the purpose, but subjectively, everything has meaning and purpose. And it's up to me to extract that meaning, to find that meaning, and to take that meaning to heart, so that I can learn from everything that I experience, whether it's positive or negative in my estimation. And God is the resource, as Brady said. God is the source, or as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:13, that God is the escape through any of the difficulties and trials and temptations that we face, that are only what happens to us as living, breathing human beings. But God is faithful, Paul says, and he will not give us, we will not have more than we can bear, because he's always at the center of every difficulty and is our means of escape. That's the way I look at it. So it's kind of an in-between position.
Mm-hmm.
And for many people, if God is not the orchestrator of everything, that makes him feel so remote and uninterested and disconnected from daily life. But I don't feel that. I still feel very connected to God, even though I don't see him pulling the strings of every event in my life. Does that make sense to you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Hopefully you'll all be back next week. And again, that's just for me. That's not prescriptive, that's descriptive. I'm describing for you the way that makes sense for me. But remember, I'm only one trauma away from having to rethink the whole thing. That's what I can say right now. But if something else happens, maybe I can't accept life on life's terms anymore, or live with hope and gratitude anymore. And I'm going to have to expand what I thought I knew. And I have to be willing to drop my nets at the shore again. I have to be willing to sell everything if I'm really going to follow Jesus, because that's a daily process. That's why he said, are you willing to pick up your cross daily? Deny yourself and follow me. It's not a one-time thing. It's what we do every day. It's like the 10th step, right? It's continually reprocessing things on a daily basis. Okay, we got to stop. So let's call it a night. Wow, I told you that the first conversation was kind of a puff piece. Was I wrong or what? I mean, we got into some deep stuff. Well, wait, I'm telling you, wait till we get to the second one. That'll even be gnarlier than this one was, and we're not even done yet. But it's great stuff.
Can we end with some humor?
Yes, absolutely.
Beth and I saw a greeting card the other day, and on the front it says, "God doesn't give you anything that you can't handle." And then you open it up, and it says, "Except for bears. Bears will kill you."
Yes.
Heavy duty biblical principle
You bet.
for those bears.
That's great. That's great. We needed that, Brady. Thank you. Okay, Scotty.
Lord, thank you for the humor and just the love we share when we come together like this, seeking out your truth and your purpose and your meaning for our life and how to navigate the waters. You're trustworthy, you always have been, Lord. We may not understand all the things you do or why you do things the way you do, but we have enough experience under our belt to realize that you do know what you're doing. And for that, we can build our trust and our faith in you. It's in your mighty name, Lord Jesus, that we pray and we give our thanks and say our amens. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, everybody. This is a barn burner. Loved it. Thank you. See you Sunday.
Thanks,
Daddy.
Bye.
Tuesday.
Really enjoyed it tonight.
Good night, guys.
Night.
Good night.
Good night, Jerry.
Good night, good night, good night, good night, Tony. Oh, Tony's already gone. Good night, Kathy. You're
Good
still there.
night.
And Jordan
Somewhere.
and Linda.
Yes, thank
All right. See you guys Saturday, Sunday.
Happy anniversary, Dave.
Yeah.
Anniversary?
Yeah, happy anniversary to you and Marion.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I didn't even say that. Yeah, it's our 29th anniversary today. So
Oh,
29 beers. What can I say? 32 years together, 29 married.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's amazing, Dave.
We did it. Almost.
I'll see you guys
Okay.
on Sunday.
See you soon. Bye-bye.